Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call this meeting to order. And our first business of the day is actually the election of a new vice chair. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Guy Caron, the new member of our committee representing the New Democratic Party. And we will proceed to the election of a chair. I just want to comment to you, Mr. Caron, that it was really an honor and privilege to have Madame Laverdière serving with us over the last 4 years, and we did a lot of good work over that time, and a lot of that was due to her efforts for sure. So welcome, and I'm sure we're going to be having an equally productive time with you on the committee.
Thank you.
Actually, we're going to proceed to the election of the vice chair, and I'm going to pass the floor to our procedural clerk, Amy, to conduct the election. Please go ahead, Amy.
So pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the second vice chair must be a member of an opposition party other than the official opposition. I'm now prepared to receive motions for the second vice chair. Mr. Aboukhlaf. It has been moved by Mr. Aboukhlaf that Guy Caron be elected as second vice chair of the committee. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion?
Yes.
I declare the motion carried and Guy Caron duly elected second vice chair of the committee.
Welcome.
Where's the hospitality suite, Mr. Caron?
Wonderful. So we're going to suspend for about 3 minutes while we get our witnesses in place for the first panel. We'll suspend. To introduce our guest for the briefing on the United Nations Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security, Mr. Graham Simpson, lead author of The Missing Piece, Independent Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security, which was released in 2018 in the United Nations Study on Youth, Peace and Security. Mr. Simpson is the director of Interpeace USA and a senior advisor to the Director General of Interpeace, an international organization established by the UN that develops innovative solutions to build peace and supports locally led peace-building initiatives around the world. Mr. Simpson, I'd like to welcome you to our committee this morning. This is obviously something that our committee is very interested in hearing about, and I'd like to maybe give you 10 or 12 minutes or so to be able to present some opening remarks, and then of course we'll open it up to the members of the committee who I'm sure are going to have lots of questions for you. So please, Mr. Simpson, proceed at your if you're ready.
Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, I'm really appreciative to the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee for this opportunity to speak to you. In some ways, I feel it an imperative as by way of report back, because we were very indebted to Canada for their support for the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security, along with Sweden, Norway, and Ireland and others. I think your contribution to this study, I hope you will see a real affirmation of some of the principles that I know you stand for behind this. By way of background, the Progress Study was called for under Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security, which was passed by the Security Council in December 2015. That really came on the back of a fairly lengthy period of time in which it was really youth-led organizations globally that were lobbying extremely hard to draw attention of the international community and the multilateral system to the fact that young people experience themselves largely as marginalized and voiceless. In some ways, championed by Jordan, a small country on the Security Council in the years leading up to 2015, the resolution was eventually passed and I think took a lot of people by surprise. And in some ways, I think we see at the Council in the passing of the resolution quite odd bedfellows with a common interest. A common interest in addressing the deficits of young people's participation and inclusion. Some because they felt that this was a matter of principle, that the world needed to have this sort of innovation, creativity, resourcefulness, and resilience of young people accessed and brought into the system. Others because they saw this as a real risk and a threat of violence and extremism if young people were marginalized and excluded. And so in some senses, with fairly different motivations, they passed Resolution 2215. But what was really unusual and something for which I am particularly grateful was the mandate of the resolution to conduct a study which became known as a progress study on youth, peace and security. The reality is, because it was a new resolution, this wasn't so much a progress study as developing a strategy for the implementation of this resolution globally. And in that capacity, I was appointed as the lead author by the Secretary General to undertake that study. I want to emphasize, I was appointed as an independent lead author. This gave me unusual room to really say what I needed to and address the issues that I thought young people were raising. It also meant that the other mandate of the study was unusually to focus on the positive contribution of young people to peace. And finally, I think implicit in this was a recognition that the Security Council was attempting to address an enduring problem of exclusion and a growing problem, which became very evident in the early phases of the study, a growing problem of young people's mistrust of their governments, of the multilateral system, and deep mistrust often even of international civil society organizations. 1.8 billion young people felt voiceless. 1/4 of those at least, and that's a conservative estimate, were living in situations of ongoing exposure to violence. So what it became very clear was that we couldn't address the problem of exclusion by reproducing the problem in our methodology. And so I want to dwell just very briefly on the methods of the study, because this was, when it was released to the Secretary, to the General Assembly in September last year, announced by the Secretary General's representative in that meeting as one of the most participatory and inclusive studies that the UN had ever undertaken. Through Canada's help, we went beyond just the usual regional consultations with young people, all of whom could speak English, all of whom had the language skills, had passports, were familiar with the UN. We insisted that we needed to access young people who were hard to reach, who would not normally have a voice in this. And so I can't do justice to the study here, but in the 10 minutes I will refer to this. I really encourage you to look at the study itself. It reflects a vibrant, extraordinary voice of young people. In the end, beyond the regional consultations, and we did 7 of those, we did 5 national consultations, 1 of those in Canada. We eventually, through a partnership of civil society organizations who had trust-based access to young people on the ground, were able to access young migrant women in the foothills of Guatemala, young combatants in the Philippines, second-generation migrants in the neighborhoods of Stockholm, African-American youth in the neighborhoods of in the south side of Chicago, young combatants or refugees in South Sudan, etc., etc. 280 focus groups in 44 countries around the world, 35 thematic and country-specific studies, a survey of youth-led peace-building organizations. This created an access to young people's voice that is unparalleled. And so it's on the basis of that I want to share with you some of the key findings and then open to your questions. The first issue that became very clear was that young people were very mindful of the extent to which they were the victims of stereotypes, particularly in relation to youth, peace and security. As soon as we spoke about peace and security, the predominant image, a very gendered image, was of a young man with a gun posing a threat, and young women consigned to the passive status of victimhood. And young people said both of these definitions of them completely denied their agency and their contributions and their resilience as contributors to peace. What these stereotypes did is they also produced what we called policy panic, a series of policy assumptions and myths that were not on the basis of our exploration based on significant evidence. The first was an assumption that youth bulges, growing proportions of young people within the population, would automatically result in high levels of violence. The second was that young people were the major threat presented by the migration waves, that there were young migrant men who were threatening infiltration and terrorism. And the third was the assumption that all young people were at risk of joining violent armed groups. The truth is, evidence suggested quite the contrary on many of these instances. It is only a tiny sliver of young people who are engaging on the wrong side of this divide. And what we had as a mandate for our study was to discover and to articulate the alternative path for investment in young people, the majority of whom were either just getting on with their lives. I don't think we should romanticize them any more than we should demonize them, but a huge number of which were actively involved in contributing to peace. And so the core message of the study, through the voice of young people, was that until we address the violence of exclusion, and that's their language, not mine, we will never prevent the violence of extremism. And in young people's own voice, this was both about political inclusion, it was about rebuilding their trust in economic systems that were inclusive, it was about recognizing the space they needed for their operations, for their freedom of movement and assembly, their opportunities for dissent, which was often, and peaceful protest, which is often seen as threatening, but we argued was actually a very important contribution to change and to peace. And very importantly, they experienced the distinct experiences of young women as opposed to young men, and the gendered character of exclusion and marginalization, which saw the youth peace and security agenda and the women's peace and security agenda fundamentally joined at the hip. This was in particular about the unique experience of young women. But one of the other things that we discovered was really importantly also about the importance of providing and addressing alternatives to toxic masculinity. And masculinity as a driver of violence and conflict was very important. So an integrated approach to gender at the heart of this. And young people's concerns around exclusion in the education system, in criminal justice and security sector reform, in reintegration of former combatants. It was very powerful for us to hear young people talking about how the majority of young people who were being reintegrated as former combatants in conflict-affected societies were young, and yet they were often being reintegrated into elder-led communities that left them feeling remarginalized. Young people were saying to us, imagine what it would look like if the receiving communities were youth organizations and were youth-led. So if the first message was we have to address all of these areas of exclusion in order to address extremism, the second message was there is an extraordinary alternative avenue for investment, not in young people as a problem to be solved, not in young people as a risk, but in the resilience and resourcefulness of youth as an attribute for peace. And in this, young people really demonstrated, and you'll see the second part of the study is a description of all of the things that we found young people were doing against all the odds. They were operating across different phases of conflict, early intervention models and prevention-based approaches with younger children, right through to post-conflict involvement in informal peace processes. They were engaged at every level, from the most local and intimate peace-building processes, people to people at the local level, through to global coalitions and partnerships. They were engaged across different typologies of violence, from gender-based violence to terrorist violence to political and criminal violence, and recognized the interface and interlinkages between these things. They were engaged in unique partnerships where they couldn't access their governments. Very often they were working with local mayors, with local actors, with different stakeholders. They were saying to us, don't ghettoize young people. We aren't just in one place. We are in youth organizations, but we are also in women's organizations, in human rights organizations, in civil society organizations. We are in governments. We are on both sides of the police community divide. They said to us, every SDG is a youth SDG. Please don't treat us just as concerned with issues of education or issues of sport and recreation. We want a stake in the entire development of our societies and in the policy around this. And young people also demonstrated the most extraordinary new and innovative methodologies, whether it was about sport and culture and arts, or most importantly, the progressive, creative occupation of cyberspace and social media as a tool for building peace and developing new peace technologies. And so what they were doing is they were crying out to us for the conclusion of the study, which is that if we want to take advantage of this demographic dividend, especially the high proportion of young people in conflict-affected societies, but not exclusively, then we need to invest in young people as a peace dividend. And this demands some seismic shifts in the way in which governments and the international system are addressing this. From largely remedial and hard security-based approaches to prevention approaches investing not in risk but in resilience of young people. It involves investing in the partnerships that young people are driving in our societies with governments, with civil society, and particularly an investment in youth-led organizations. And involves the development of new norms in our society to socialize 2250 as a resolution as a meaningful domestic tool. And so the study produces 3 categories of recommendations. I won't go into them in detail, I don't have time, in which we motivate very strongly for an investment in the resilience of young people, in their agency, in their leadership, in their organizations, funding, through supporting peace networks in the youth sector, organizational capacities, filling the data gaps. It's unbelievable how difficult it is to find gender and age disaggregated data on young people. The second category are about addressing all those areas of exclusion in the polity, in economics, in development policy, in the educational arena, in gender terms of young people in society. And the third is to invest in the partnerships that young people forge, whether it's at the UN, whether it's in the establishment of youth delegates within the agencies of the UN and through governments' representatives to the UN, whether it's about the consultative spaces that we need to create for young people, whether it's about the integration of young people fully into the 2030 agenda for development, the 1325 agenda and the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and the annual reporting of the Secretary General to the Security Council. In all these arenas, we've made a series of recommendations to address these problems of exclusion. And with that, I will leave you. I'll say one last thing. I was really struck when I examined the Feminist International Assistance Policy of Canada to see how the language of human dignity, growth that works for everyone, environmental and climate action, inclusive governance, and peace and security, these are all the platforms that the Youth Peace and Security agenda addresses. And so I think we see a very powerful resonance with Canada's international concerns and those of the Youth Peace and Security agenda. And I'd go one step further. I would encourage you to recognize that we discovered young people exist everywhere in society. And this is also an essential issue for Canada to think about as a domestic issue as much as it is an international one. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simpson. We will move straight to questions from members, and we will begin with MP Abou-Taif, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a wonderful presentation this morning. On page 4 of paragraph 7 of the report, the report's comments that youth often fall in a gray area between their rights and the protections afforded to children and the rights and political entitlements the adults have. And in that case, you'd expect that youth should also have. So can you please speak to the types of rights and freedoms youth are routinely denied by virtue of their age, and if there are regional commonalities in this denial of rights, what those might be?
This is an extraordinary question, and I thank you for it. Yes, what we recognized was that in some senses, so let me begin by saying, although the resolution 2250 defines young people as 18 to 29, what became very clear to us is that youth is much more a socio-cultural phenomenon than it is a chronological age. And that one of the phenomena that we identified was how, in fact, young people were often trapped in youthhood. There was one author refers to this as waithood, because the factors the rites of passage that dictate progress into adulthood are denied many young people. This is very gendered, and in fact it's not consistent. So young men who can't afford to marry, can't get jobs, can't acquire houses, can't acquire the formal status of adulthood, are trapped in the status of youthhood despite their age. And often young women who are being married off, often forcibly, into and childbearing at much younger age, acquire the formal status of women adults much younger than they ought to. This is illustrative because what it shows is that often young people are outside of the category formally that acquires protections under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so they're not protected from in the same way that children are. But because of this waithood, they often don't acquire the trappings of adulthood that come with that should come with all these rights. So we talk about a rights realization gap. And I raise this because it is about distinct things. So on the one hand, what we definitely found, and particularly in conflict-affected societies, where the space for civil society is closing down very often, is that the rights of assembly, participation, political engagement are often denied young people. So age bars to young people's ability to run for office. But also the repressive space that often means young people are victimized. And so on the one hand, we are looking at that set of protections that is really critical. But we would be misstepping, I think, if we didn't recognize that sometimes it's the gap between formal rights, which exist in the legislation, and substantive rights to which young people do not have access in reality because of generational and gender-based issues. And that includes socioeconomic rights, access to land, access to etc., and the rights to operate as organizations, as youth-led organizations. So I would draw your attention to those two distinct arenas, some of which are formal, some of which are about protections and should be there and aren't, others of which are about a rights realization gap where I think young people are uniquely excluded and marginalized politically, economically, socially.
You mentioned 1.8 billion youth are marginalized or they face these kind of rights being taken, if you wish, or where they would want to be and they're not getting what they want, what they deserve in a sense. And when we have 1.8 billion is about 25% of the world population, which means must be these youth are somehow in certain regions, in certain areas where tribal societies are more affecting the life of the future and the future of these youth compared to civil societies where the state involved more and more. So what is the United Nations doing in this fashion? And how do you think that this is going to be solved? Because we know that the problem is growing by the growth of the population. And we believe that, or we see that in certain regions, the youth population is growing compared to the advanced world. So how do you see that?
So I think you're right, and I think we need to both distinguish and recognize that there are some countries where the problem is a increasingly contracting youth population and a growing population of older people in parts of the world. In others, there is the phenomenon of the youth bulge, the growing youth populations, and there I think the challenge to the absorptive capacity of societies is striking and needs to be addressed. I'm not sure that we should too readily distinguish between conflict-affected societies and societies that are free of conflict. It was very striking to us, and I draw this comparison deliberately, to hear young men on the south side of Chicago talking about guns in ways that were strikingly similar to young men in South Sudan. And we need to recognize that, because I think the experience of marginalization and exclusion of young people is not an exclusive phenomenon of the conflict-affected societies of the Global South. So whilst I think these are important observations, I also think we need to nuance them with what we heard from the study.
MP Vandenveld, please.
for your report and for being here today. You speak about marginalization and exclusion. How does this affect political processes, democratic political processes? I know that there are a number of studies that show that globally, young people today are less attached to democracy and more inclined toward accepting forms of authoritarianism than in previous generations. And I noticed that in your report, it talks about various ways of making sure that young people are included in democratic political processes. How are you seeing this? Are young people, I know that they're not trusting as much the traditional democratic elections and governments. Are they seeing that this is not necessarily, is it, a number of young people are saying that that is futile, that democratic processes can't change things. Do they see this as a way of changing, a way of being included? Or are they starting to write off those kinds of democratic processes? And what does that mean for the future of particularly some of the fledgling democracies?
It means we have to act, and we have to enrich the exercise and processes of inclusion and participation, and do more to accredit these systems. I think you're right. I think that. So, firstly, I think we need to disaggregate what we mean by political participation, because, we had a submission by the Department of Political Affairs, as it was at that point in the UN, which I think was very helpful, because what they were doing is they were saying, in looking at their own practice, they were saying, how do we disaggregate what young people's political participation looks like? And on the one hand, they were attentive to the formal political process, to electoral processes, and the formal governance issues. But they were also talking about national dialogue processes, the participation of young people and responsiveness to young people's demand that they have a voice in policy arenas that affect their lives, but in which they have very little stake. I'll give you two examples. It was very striking to us that young people often describe two among many, but two very prolific places where they said, if you're thinking about the state-society relationship through the youth lens, what are the places where young people intersect most directly with their states? And they were saying it's in relation to the criminal justice system and in relation to education. And on both of these arenas, they were saying, we are aware of criminal justice reform processes and juvenile justice processes, etc., but we have no stake and no voice in that policy sphere. Similarly, we are the primary targets of an education system in which we have very little voice in the policy world that defines educational priorities, curricula, etc. So there's a very tactile method that falls below the formal levels of political participation that I think young people are very astute in saying, when we think about what we mean by expanding participation and process, these are the arenas in which we are most affected and that we should have a voice and don't. For DPA, it was very interesting because this extended to reconciliation processes in the wake of conflict, to constitution making and reform processes, to a spectrum of political engagements rather than just in the formal process of electoral politics. And I think that is enriching because it also expands the spaces in which we can rebuild young people's trust and sense of belonging and confidence. A particular concern around young people being excluded because of their age from running for office and saying we need to have more young people in office. And so it's not just can we vote, it's can we run. And in some societies, the bar on that. A real honesty and recognition by young people that inclusion is not unconditional. So in many societies, a concern that participation in political processes often subjected them to manipulation, to party political control, to a series of manipulative and corrupt intents, and young people saying we don't want to participate in systems that appear to be corrupt or servicing elites, etc. This is not all young people, but these are very important voices because I think they nuance the way in which we think about this. And then in answer to your excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a chest cold. In answer to your last question, yes, I do think this is affecting this is a trust issue. And in some senses, I think there was a growing message of young people's loss of confidence in formal representative politics. Part of what I've said is that there are other ways of engaging in what participation means that are not just about narrow approaches to representation. But it was also, I think, what we need to recognize is that young people were saying this is also not just about you inviting us to the table you've set, but recognizing the table we have set for ourselves. And there, the innovative, creative spaces in which young people are creating places of direct action, of participatory democracy through social media and cyberspace. Yes, these things present their own risks if they aren't moderated, and they can be grabbed and controlled by others, by those with nefarious purpose. But there are very important participatory technologies that young people have to teach us about ways of expanding our democracy and creating participatory approaches to democracy. And we also can't be naive about that. The digital divide, which is, by the way, is also very gendered. These are important issues to engage. So I hope I've answered your question without posing more questions than I've answered.
Yes, no, thank you for that. Actually, on the social, no? Okay.
Time up. MP Caron, s'il vous plaît.
I'm sorry, my fault.
No, no.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que vous pourriez mettre votre écouteur, s'il vous plaît?
Could you perhaps put on your headset so you can hear to the interpretation? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sampson, for a very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions for you on the recommendations in the study. Inclusion, first of all. Something that struck me in the report. Now, for young people, the freedom of association might be affected. I'm curious about union freedom and the ability to demonstrate peacefully. What came out of the study on the obstacles to these types of freedoms? And the second question that I have on those freedoms that are affected also. Now, I think we've talked a lot about the identification of barriers, obstacles as well, but there are other solutions that have been identified, or are you waiting for the development of these solutions?
Some senses, I think I addressed some of the questions around the freedoms in relation to the earlier question on human rights, and I won't dwell on that. What I will say is that I think globally the prevailing frustration of young people was the stereotype that sees them primarily as a risk and a threat. And so youthful protest and dissent, even when peaceful, is often treated, particularly in undemocratic societies, but not exclusively, as a problem to be solved, as a risk factor. And so I think that the prevailing concern that we had was the massive investment in security-based and criminal justice-based responses to young people at the expense of an investment in all the resilience and resourcefulness and creative spaces. And in some ways, I think what young people were doing is they were demonstrating that there is an alternative investment path. It's one of the reasons why in the recommendations we've staked a claim for the establishment of a fund of $1.8 billion, $1 per young person. That's not a lot. As a signifier of what we need to invest in. And that investment in youth-led peace-building organization is the critical space for free operation and environment. It has to be about securing not just the institutions and not just funding the institutions. And there's a risk of doing harm in polluting them by doing that, but very much about ensuring the space in which they can freely operate. And I think that these are critical rights that young people across the globe were speaking to us about. And so when you ask, are there solutions that are presented? Actually, I think the study is peppered with illustrations of the ways in which, with minimal resources, and honestly, the survey undertaken of youth-led peace-building organizations showed that it is 80 to 90% of youth organizations are volunteer-based, are based on extremely limited resources, $10,000 a year for their organizations. There were about 8% that needed or were spending $100,000 a year or more. That there is an investment opportunity in these organizational forms that is about expanding democracy and expanding the room for participation.
Merci beaucoup. Je regardais pour le temps parce que j'avais une autre question qui va.
I have another question which might take you some time to answer. Something that unites young people across the world is the issue of technology, the social media, first of all, which can be a strength in terms of mobilization and organization, but it can also be an issue because they can also lead to isolation, because social media are mainly based on algorithms, right? And it brings people with the same interests together, but you tend to lose diversity. What's the role of technology in your opinion, rather, to allowing young people to make a contribution to peace and security in the world?
You're absolutely right. I think that in some ways the discourse around social media and ICT technologies, etc., reflects the broader problems that we've been talking about. On the one hand, this is very easily seen, especially when occupied by young people, as a threatening space, a place where they'll be recruited into nefarious organizations, a place where they're endangered. But on the other hand, there's actually a real innovation and creativity in the way in which young people are cultivating those spaces, very often for good. I think that it's very healthy for us to think about the organizational attributes and limitations of these forms of social interaction. And I have to say, I don't think for young people this was ever articulated to me as an alternative to participation in the other spaces in society. As an organizational tool, I think young people were very astute in understanding you can establish connectivity without really connecting people in durable ways, that it's not a substitute for social movements, for example. So I think young people were very clear about finding the right balance, and it's not a simple solution. That said, I think that the innovation and the technologies for peace that are there and that young people are occupying are at risk of being closed down in the process in which we're trying to moderate the negative impacts of the social media and technology space. This features very prominently in the study. I don't think that we answer all these questions, but what we certainly do is reflect young people's voice about exactly the complexity that you've identified, and I think this is something we have to wrestle with. I don't think the solution is to shut down the space. I think the solution is to invest in the positive manifestations and the ways in which it's being used and crafted.
Thank you.
Merci. MP Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Simpson, for your presence here this morning. Question on Minister Freeland announced some funding to LC initiatives. The whole motive is to get younger women involved in the peacekeeping. Can you speak on that, how it's going to impact around the world with the small funds allocating towards it?
I can speak on it. I probably shouldn't because it's not an area of my expertise. What I will say is this. I think that there is a really important parallel here in the way in which we think about and the potential dangers, excuse me, of securitizing the conversation, whether it's about youth peace and security or women peace and security, and I think they are very closely connected. So I don't believe for one moment, let me say, I think that there is a very powerful and important message being sent in establishing the presence of young women in our armed forces, in peacekeeping forces, in policing institutions, and not just in those institutions, but ideally in the structures of command and control as well. And I think this is a very important contribution because I think that women bring a different discourse, potentially, to these areas of the provision of security and policing. That said, this shouldn't be a substitute for recognizing the alternatives to the security-based solutions. And so as long as there is a parallel investment in young people and women, young women's participation in other arenas of society, in non-securitized arenas of society, then I think we have a more holistic and comprehensive approach to women, peace and security. And that includes in areas of the economy and a broader polity, etc., etc. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Kind of. You said youth maybe 20 times during your address. Are female more effective around the world in peacekeeping than men or the young boys?
My understanding is that the evidence reflects that, but as I say, it's not an area of expertise. I can't cite the studies that would back that up. So I'm not doing a study of young women's participation in peace processes, in peacekeeping operations specifically. There's no question in my mind that young people are demanding that they participate and that they are present in these arenas, and there's no question in my mind that there is still a gender divide, even where the generational issues are being addressed. And there is a prevalence of young men in these institutions, and I think that it's very important that we increase the number of young women in these institutions. I don't doubt that this, but I can't provide you with the empirical evidence that this produces more effective peacekeeping.
Okay, let's move on to the involvement of youth around the world. And you mentioned that it's as important as at the international stage as at home. So the question comes, are we lagging behind in Canada when it comes down to youth involvement?
I certainly wouldn't say that. I mean, my instinct is that Canada may have a great deal to offer the world as a society which demonstrates a very clear commitment to inclusion in ways that others don't. I think that Canada's wrestling with the particular experiences of its Indigenous population's needs, and I think the transgenerational impact which that has had on young people in the present generation in those communities. I think that this has perhaps gotten attention. I wouldn't be so arrogant as to suggest it hasn't received enough attention or that it necessarily can receive enough attention. But I think that these are real attributes, and I think that they are assets in which Canada, in partnership with other societies, may have a lot to offer. It's for this reason that I want to emphasize the importance of Canada owning this issue as a domestic issue. Because I think that you can always deepen the participation of young people and get that right on a gender-balanced basis as well. And I think that Canada has an extraordinary platform for doing this. And I would go further than that. I think that this could be, if I were to be perhaps provocative, I think this could be a very powerful vehicle in Canada's international affairs platform, both because in the future the UN Security Council will require members of that council that are willing to champion the issue of youth, peace and security and keep this alive. I think that's an amazing opportunity for Canada to claim that space at some point in the future.
Last one, what do you think about having a UN office in Toronto instead of New York?
I have a bit of a love affair with New York myself, and I'm happily, but I also have a number of family and relatives living in Toronto, so I have a personal dual loyalty on this, and would be very comfortable with it. I think that there is a more important agenda for me, and that is that. Excuse me, I wear the hat of an international civil society peace-building organization. What the Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security has done, largely under the radar and through the back door, it's challenged the assumptions that the UN has made for many decades about its inability to forge partnerships with civil society. And I think what happened with the Progress study is we built a coalition of civil society actors who could access young people in a way that governments and the multilateral system couldn't. And so if you want a center of excellence in Toronto, my strong recommendation would be that you don't try to reproduce the UN offices in New York, but that you think very creatively about the role Canada can play in fostering the interface between the multilateral system and civil society as non-state actors. I think this is an enormous gap to be filled. Use Toronto for that.
Thank you. MP Vandenbeld, back to you. You can finish off that previous question.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask about social media, which you got to in Mr. Caron's question. But I have another question. I know a number of countries have a National Youth Congress as a coordinating body for young people in the country. Is that something that, can you give an example of how those succeed and whether that might be something Canada should undertake?
So this is a really interesting question, and I'm afraid there's no simple answer to it. Youth congresses, youth councils, parallel structures, there are some amazing examples of where these are truly representative. They provide genuine access for young people into the political process and a stepping stone, especially if there's a creative reciprocal relationship between the formal political structures of parliaments and the youth parliaments or youth structures, youth congresses that sit below that. I think it requires very careful design. It's challenging because we need to recognize that youth is a transitional status, that we constantly need to reproduce youth leadership. And these may be very powerful tools for doing that, for cultivating youth leadership that is then channeled into other arenas of political participation. But the channel has to be clear and it has to be open. If it's seen by young people as an alternative to the real thing, they will distrust it. And worse than that, there are some instances in which young people, for very good reason, are allergic to youth councils or to youth congresses because they are seen as a deliberate strategy of oppressive and undemocratic governments to cultivate their youth, to create a youth voice which reflects their political control and manipulation. And so I'm afraid there's no one size fits all. I've been encouraging youth councils that do have these credentials in Finland and in Denmark and where the youth councils themselves to work with youth councils in other societies that are conflict affected in order to help them strengthen the independence of those structures. But I have to say, I think that it would be a mistake to think beyond the relevance and importance of this and to consult young people in our country on it at any country level. I think the one-size-fits-all runs the risk of empowering structures which are an alternative to empowerment of young people and corrupt them rather than the opposite.
What about a national action plan? I mean, we know that on Women, Peace and Security, on Security Council Resolution 1325, which 2250 was partly modeled on, there are national action plans in place for different countries. Do you know of countries that have a national action plan on Security Council Resolution 2250, and what countries would they be, and would that be something that we could potentially adopt?
Excuse me. Yes, there are. Finland has gone down the path of establishing a national action plan. There are one or two others as well. I'm not sure exactly how far down the path they are. We considered this very seriously and took, we were strongly advised by stakeholders in the Women, Peace and Security agenda who were both very positive and extremely wary of us reproducing the National Action Plan endeavor. In countries where this was achievable, it was achievable very quickly and was a powerful tool, signaled the right kind of commitment, created mechanisms of accountability for government against a plan, etc., etc. In societies where this was taxing limited capacity, actually the action plan itself became the object of the exercise. And there was, I think a lot of women's organizations felt that the key issues got mired in the bureaucracy of an action plan that actually was dysfunctional, inefficient, and in some ways became an exclusively government-held endeavor rather than a participatory and inclusive one. So again, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I also have to say that I think in some countries a comprehensive engagement with youth peace and security, or the youth empowerment, youth inclusion issues is readily available and possible. I think in other societies it's going to be more tactically important to think about the entry point issue, whether it's education or employment or political participation, and try and connect them, but not necessarily develop a national action plan that is about all things youth, because I think that may actually make it less operable. And so what we've emphasized, less than the action plan as a blueprint, is the establishment of national coalitions. It's the partnership endeavor that we think we need to emphasize for governments to invest in, that the partnerships between government, civil society stakeholders, and the diverse range of stakeholders in the partnerships for building a youth peace and security agenda is much more important as an entry point approach than a national action plan as a blueprint, which doesn't exclude it as a possibility, but doesn't presume it as the right fit for all systems or societies.
And is timing okay? MP Abultaif, please.
Peace and security and youth is just a topic here. And in the report, youth believe or have great hope for the role of education. And that because it's a potentially is a transformative tool to peace built-in process. So in that fashion, I think the emphasis on education has to also to do with the focus on building peace and moving forward. So how do you, or can you share your insights as to how this can be realized? How can we build that? Because also education is not just about one topic, especially in this world. So how can we distinguish that and make sure that we realize how to move forward in order to be able to make sense of peace and security for youth?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I wish I could do justice to the complexity of the feedback we got from young people on this. So on the one hand, I think you're right. I think we need to see the innovative and diverse space that education offers. And so young people were always talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary education. They were always talking about formal and informal education. Societies learning about their past, museums, the range of factors. So education, not just as a formal curriculum and in the schools and tertiary institutions, but informal education as well. We were struck by the number of organizations out there, both civil society organizations and youth-led organizations, that were doing innovative and creative work on educational issues, from early intervention models. So, for example, in the focus on masculinity and the fact that young people are saying we have to address this issue of masculinity. I remember talking to a young gangster from Honduras who was saying to me, "You're talking to me about masculine identity as a destructive force. I'm 20 years old. You're about 15 years too late." And he was saying early childhood intervention models, when we're starting to deal with values-based approaches, issues like masculinity, and trying to address the negative forms of masculinity or embed more positive discourses, non-violent discourses about masculinity that are not necessarily shaped around power over or access to young women, we need to start much earlier, early intervention models. So UNICEF, although their concern is under 18-year-olds, recognize that as part of a contribution to a youth peace and security strategy, early intervention models in schools-based education at primary and secondary level is critical. The period of adolescence is absolutely critical. On the other hand, it was interesting to us that young people, and it may have been about the selections of the young people we spoke to, although I think we accessed a uniquely wide range, were saying, be careful, don't trap this just in vocational education. The idea of education simply as we don't want to be seen as economic automatons who are being designed for places in the economy, jobs in the community. Education is much richer than that. It doesn't mean that vocational education is unimportant to young people, but they were saying, don't just focus on this as a vocational issue, as an educational issue for the purposes of employment. not least because in some societies, young people were saying the gap between the educational qualifications that we can acquire and the opportunities to use that in creative, inclusive spaces in society, that gap produces real frustration. So if we don't recognize that education has to be utilizable for young people, we make a grave mistake. But that doesn't mean we can consign it just to the area of vocational education. So yes, in all these arenas, I think young people were seeing education as critical. But I will say this. It was very powerful for us, the way in which they described the triangular relationship between education, employment, and civic engagement. That young people were saying, we don't want education that gives us no pathway, but peace education is very important to us. They were saying, we don't want jobs that just make us street sweepers. We want jobs that have meaning and that reflect a contribution to society. I think this is a very powerful voice in the way we understand the relationship between education, jobs, and peace for young people.
Do I have 1 minute?
You can, yes, you got another minute.
Just to build on the question, we know that you, through your observation and consultations in many countries in the world, how hopeful or how optimistic you are over the curriculums of some of the nations in tackling peace and security in the education and the amalgamation between education for job or education for building process and building better society. How do you see that? How optimistic you are over your observations?
So on the education stuff, we saw unbelievable innovation and creativity in the way in which young people who took control of educational curriculum innovated. We saw extraordinary civil society organizations who are often standing outside of formal educational curriculum, but sometimes in very creative partnerships with formal education systems to connect the formal and the informal forms of education. And we saw a real appetite among young people for values-based education, for education that was about driving values in society. These things were very important. They were part of what, for me, in the last 2 years, was the privilege of spending 2 years with young people who would probably be even more intimidated than I am by the protocols and formalities of these spaces, that would often feel excluded from them. And yet, in a way, I would like to uncap the bottle of everything I've seen in the last 2 years and open in this room so that you could share the sense of inspiration I have from my conversations with young people, because so often we see them as dangerous.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Simpson, just want to thank you for your testimony before us this morning. Obviously, you can tell by the questions and discussion, it's been very well received and exceptionally insightful. So with that, we are going to adjourn, get our next... Suspend, get our next panel in place. Yep, not adjourn. Get our next panel in place, and we will begin shortly. Thank you,
and thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Suspend. Resuming. There has been no single issue that has been of greater significance and discussed more both at the Subcommittee for International Human Rights and also in this Foreign Affairs Committee over the last number of years than the plight for democracy in Venezuela. And it's something that we've had, again, multiple engagements on, including hosting members of the democratically elected National Assembly back in 2016. Again, outside of this committee, also having numerous roundtables, both before and after the government support for the Lima Group initiative. So it's with that we have today Orlando Vieira Blanco, the representative to Canada of Juan Guaido, interim president of Venezuela, here to brief us on the continuing repression that's happening in Venezuela. We see the images. I just got to spend several days with Ambassador Diego Aria, hearing firsthand as well what's happening on the streets, and of course the horrendous situation of displacement happening, especially into Colombia. So, Mr. Villarablanco, it's an honor to have you here before us. I know there's lots of interest around the table in getting an update from you on the events over the last several months. And I welcome you to the committee, and I'd like to ask you, as is our practice, if you would like to take 10 minutes or so to provide us an update, and then I know there's going to be lots of interest and lots of questions provided by members of all sides around the table. Please, sir, go ahead.
So, first of all, good morning. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to try to give you an updating about what's going on in Venezuela. Since 5 years ago, I had been facing this committee with a lot of witnesses and political leaders from Venezuela, trying to make a file about the dramatic tragedy that we live in Venezuela. 5 years later, the situation getting worse. We live in an emergency. We live the worst humanitarian situation that ever happened in my country, and even happened in any Latin American country in the history. When you talk about that, we can see 8,000 people in executions in Venezuela. When you see 30,000 political prosecutors, when you can see or you can get about each 3.5 children which born in Venezuela just die. When you have 300,000 people died in Venezuela in the last 20 years for criminality without justice, with 94% of not justice. It is an embarrassing statistic that just coming from a regime that not just devastate the economy in the country, not just devastate our stability. It's a social devastation. It's a humanitarian devastation. It's a political devastation. And in the end, it's devastation of a concept of the state. We have no institution. We have no separate of power. And now we have no energy. We have no power. We have no light. We have no food. We have no medicine. We have no water. So when you can see, and I repeat it again, each time that I have the opportunity to repeat this amount, I repeat it because it's important to understand the magnitude of the devastation in Venezuela. Venezuela have received in 20 years $1.4 trillion of dollars. 1.4 million of dollars. So if you take in consideration that the city of Dubai, the whole city, just have a cost of 250 billion, 1/5 of 1.4 trillion. The devastation in Venezuela for corruption and for malpractice is immense. It is some kind of record as well. Recently, the chief of the staff of the president interim Juan Guaido has been arrested. This is not an issue. It's not a simple arrest, imprisonment. It's the staff, it's the chief of the staff of the interim president recognized by Canada and by the most democracy, the more important democracies in the world. And that is a situation, it is a fact of a state. An international community have to take in consideration, have to take some kind of reflection about what this situation means under the international public order. We have more painful statistic I'm not talking right now, I'm not talking today as ambassador. I'm talking today from the heart from my people. When you see a Venezuelan children just drinking water from a toxic river, when you see that just on Saturday, a girl, 23 years old, just have a children in the streets, liberated in the street. When you see a good friend of my family who died in the hospital just on Sunday because they have no power to give them, to keep working the machine to breathe. This is not a single situation in the middle of the 21st century. When you see what's going on in Rwanda in 1994, when you see what's going on in Somalia, when you see what's going on in many devastating countries before a genocide happened, think about that in Venezuela, we are just in the cliff of a possible civil confrontation. Again, no water, no medicine, no foods, no lights, no power, no justice. It's impossible to live like this. I just came to share with you one more and last reflection. When I came to Canada the first time, I was 17 years old. I came as an invitation of my father-in-law just to see a country that I was fascinated, not just with the immensity of the country. I was fascinated at the age of 17 years old just with one concept, justice. You breathe justice in Canada. And justice for the modern people means freedom. And freedom means happiness. And happiness means love. That's why I love Canada, because you have justice, you have happiness, you have freedom, you have love. In Venezuela, we lost justice, we lost freedom, we love happiness, and we lost the possibility just to have a dignity life. We need the help of the international community, but we need something else from Canada and from the international community. A huge reflection about this situation. And with respect, it's not about to keep condemn this situation. It's not about more declaration and a statement. It's about to move forward and to think how to create a coalition to save our country and to create justice, freedom, democracy, and rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll go straight into questions, and we'll begin with MP O'Toole, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ambassador, for coming. It's good to see you again. And through you to President Guaido and the people in Venezuela, please know that all sides here in Canada are with you through this crisis. And I think it's important, since this is televised, for Canadians to know just the full extent of the crisis. So I'm going to speak to you a bit about it, and I'm going to refer to the OAS preliminary report on the refugee crisis specifically, which they call the largest crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The estimates are by this year, there will be almost 5.5 million refugees from your country. So the people that are staying are facing nutrition challenges, food shortages, healthcare shortages, but the people leaving are fleeing and going to surrounding states. Do you see over the last year this migration, this refugee departure increasing? And do you see any end in sight if the Maduro regime clings to power?
Of course, in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, the increase of the exodus in Venezuela is about for maybe more than 3 million people. So maybe in 2014 we handled some statistic that in Venezuela we have like a 1.5 million people just immigrate, and now we're talking easily about 4.5 million people walking from Caracas to Argentina. It's not just a single immigration by plane or by car. People walking from Venezuela and dying in the way to try to reach not just Colombia or Peru, Ecuador. The impact, the economy of this country in the region is immense. If you're talking about Colombia, Colombia has like a 1.2 million of Venezuelan people, and the cost per person is about 3,500 euros. So if you make a math, that's going to represent like a 4 billions just to try to maintain or try to help these people in a year in such economy. Latin American economy, they are not ready to absorb. They cannot absorb this kind of immigration. That is part of the consequences of the immigration. Other statistic, if you want to see, Venezuela has 90% of the in the hospital, the public hospital, 90% they have no medicine and they have no instruments in order to help the people. We have to take in consideration that people died in Venezuela because they have no medicine to illness like AIDS, like diabetes, etc. We have a new illness that just disappeared in the past in Venezuela, like a malaria, or like another infectious illness that just was eradicated in my country. So the impact of the crisis in the last 3 or 4 years just getting worse and worse, and that's why people just decide to go. And finally, just to let you know, it's a breaking news yesterday that I call the ex-government in Venezuela trying just to take it out the immunity of President Guaido in order to try maybe to follow him, maybe to put in prison Mr. Juan Guaido as well. So that is the situation in Venezuela nowadays.
Thank you. And you outlined in your address 8,000 killed, 30,000 persecuted. The OAS in this report attributes the massive outmigration of Venezuelan citizens to 3 things: generalized violence, the humanitarian crisis and shortages, but also widespread violation of human rights by the Maduro regime, which they indicate in this report was determined by a panel of experts to constitute crimes against humanity as far back as 2014. We're getting to a point where we see the Maduro regime, as you said, arrest Mr. Guaido's chief of staff, try to claim that Mr. Guaido cannot serve in public office for 15 years. Where does the international community and the concept of responsibility to protect come in? Because here we have a situation where there's thousands being affected by what has been determined by experts to be crimes against humanity, and immense suffering of a people, and essentially paralysis to even get aid in. Do you feel we're approaching circumstances where the responsibility to protect doctrine should be examined to alleviate this suffering and to halt the crimes against humanity?
When you just, the statistic that you already have read is coming from 2016, and we are already in 2019. If you ask me in 2016 if R2P responsibility to protect a fight in Venezuela, I would say, and I write about it a lot, I would say yes. 3 years later, how many people died in Venezuela because we kept thinking about responsibility to protect as an academic or as a just a doctrine or as a single principle? So the answer is yes, of course. And I don't want to see my country in 3 more years, 1 more year, just waiting for more consideration in order to convince international community what's the situation in Venezuela.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move to MP Saini, please.
Good morning, Mr. Vera Blanco. Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you very much for your powerful testimony. I have 3 questions that I would like to ask. One is based on the legitimacy of what is happening. One is on the humanitarian crisis, especially when you reference the Supreme Court of Venezuela, and one on the geopolitical situation. So let's start with the legitimacy, because there are certain people in Canada and certain political parties that believe that Maduro is the duly elected leader of Venezuela because apparently there were free and fair elections. But if I refer to your constitution, there's 3 principles within your constitution: Section 233, Section 333, and Section 350. So Section 233 and 333 may be debatable, but I'd like to read you Section 350 because I think that speaks clearly to the legitimacy of Mr. Guaido being the interim president. And Article 350 says, "The people of Venezuela, true to their republican tradition and their struggle for independence, peace, and freedom, shall disown any regime, legislation, or authority that violates democratic values, principles, and guarantees, or encroaches upon human rights." Based on these 3 parts of the Constitution, do you think that Mr. Guaido's declaration of being the interim president is legitimate?
Okay, I have to move, maybe I have to clarify why is a legitimate presidency, which one we have with Mr. Maduro. In 2018, we have to remember that he called for a constituent, which was illegal, because under our constitution, it's not possible that the president convoke a constituent, and then such convocation and so calls have to be ratified by popular vote. That did not happen. That's why the constituent was illegal. But such illegal constituent just called for a presidential election without, furthermore, without the terms. In order to do so, with many disadvantage to the opposition, with the illegality of many parties from the opposition. So Mr. Maduro just became president in a legal and illegitimate election. When the term just expired in January 10, 2018, so that's the moment when the 233 article apply, which is a succession of the constitutional succession in order to create the substitution of the new president when you have absence of a legitimate president in the power. And that's why the president of the assembly take the presidency of Venezuela on the legitimate basis. So at the end, Mr. Guaido just applied right now a sequence. First, we call the cease of the usurpation, because it's an usurpation from Mr. Maduro, which is an illegitimate president right now in Venezuela. The application of the 350, because 350 is that we call the right, the legitimate right of the people to defend the constitution and democracy. And that's it. And then go to a transition, political transition, and then to call to free election.
So I don't think I'll get to all 3 questions, but I'll ask you my final question. And this is about the geopolitical situation that's happening in Venezuela right now. I'm sure you noticed, or I'm sure you read, that last week Russia sent 100 military advisors and has been sending humanitarian aid. China also has sent about 65 tons of medical supplies. So right now, when we look at the situation, we look at the heavy investment that China has in Venezuela, and we look at the Russian investment that's happening or has happened in Venezuela in the past, where they are trying to recover their investment, either through oil or through other means. How is it now Venezuela is going to sort of make its way forward when there's a Russian involvement and there's a Chinese involvement? The Chinese involvement is up to $60 billion in Venezuela. They have a lot of involvement in the Venezuelan economy, but you also have Russia now that's sending military advisors. Going forward, how will you negotiate 2 superpowers who are effectively also implicating themselves in the situation in Venezuela?
I don't know how the international community, which is concerned about human rights in Venezuela and the situation, is going to deal with Russia and China. It's an issue that have to be negotiated and have to be solved by the international community. But I can tell you something. The first investors that need to change the government in Venezuela, because the devastation and the total paralyzation of the country is Russian and Chinese. They never going to get back the money that they invest in Venezuela with this kind of situation in Venezuela. They need a change as well. So I don't see that that's going to be a real obstacle in order to achieve any kind of change over the table with China and Russia, because in my own opinion, China and Russia is an issue that can't be solved over the table. The problem is how we can resolve the situation, how Venezuelan people can solve the situation alone, because it's an indefense country and people with no arms and even with not will to proceed in that way. It's a Pacific people. So that's the real issue. And one more thing, it's not investment. It's not any kind of economic and material issue that justify this kind of crimes of humanity that committed in Venezuela. Is no way to justify an investment that could conduct and could in some way patronize a regime like this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Before we go to MP Caron, I just want to let members know there is a vote scheduled for 10:35. So as long as it's okay with members around the table, we can go until maybe 25 after or 20 after, just to and then we'll pop upstairs and adjourn at that point. Okay, MP Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, bienvenue, monsieur.
Hello, welcome, Mr. Vieira Blanco. I think you speak French. You understand French. Yes, I do. I'd like to pick up on the issue of humanitarian aid. Once again, of course, it's necessary. We see that. One of the concerns we might have is the politicization of humanitarian aid. We've seen that with the refusal of American aid at the Colombian border and the acceptance by Mr. Maduro of Russian and Chinese aid. Now, in terms of Mr. Guaido, a depoliticization of humanitarian aid, is that something he can achieve so that assistance can be provided to Venezuela? Well, Mr. Guaido thinks that humanitarian aid should not be politicized. It's humanitarian aid, period. The politicization of humanitarian aid is being undertaken by the Maduro regime, which has preferred Chinese and Russian humanitarian aid. This is what they've done. That's politicization, if you like. But for Mr. Guaido, humanitarian aid should not be politicized. It's an emergency situation. It's a situation which requires humanitarian aid urgently, and you can see that through the statistics I've given you already. Now, what action could Canada take to assist? Now, there are countries, bordering countries, which are being affected by refugees. So we've talked about humanitarian aid, the humanitarian problems in Venezuela, but there are neighbouring countries under great pressure as well, Peru, Colombia, and the rest. What could Canada do to assist those countries that are feeling the impact of the crisis in Venezuela? Well, Canada already has a policy of providing humanitarian aid to Venezuela. They could perhaps extend this to Ecuador, Colombia as well. That's very, very important because there's an economic impact through the exodus of Venezuelan people to neighboring countries. I think that it's clear that the best way for Canada to help with the situation facing the neighboring countries, Colombia, for example, well, that would be that would be through assistance for those, economic assistance to those countries. Do I still have some time left? Yes. Well, I can see parallels between what's happening in Venezuela and what happened in Syria as well. Now, of course, there's the international geopolitics. There's China, Russia, the US as well on differing sides. Is this a concern you have? And how do you think external actors can foster a solution which would perhaps take us away or prevent what happened in Syria happening again? Well, for the time being, the building of an international coalition is essential. And the coalition must foster the adherence to the law in Venezuela. But we know that the regime has economic pressures. So really, the international community has to be on the right side of history. The international coalition is already taking steps to put economic pressure on the regime. But I don't think that policy is sufficient to bring about the desired results. Final question. If Mr. Guaido became the recognized president and the legitimate president of Venezuela, would he still intend to hold elections, and when? I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. Does he still intend to hold elections, and how quickly? You're talking about future elections? If Mr. Guaido becomes a legitimate and elected president, does he still intend to hold democratic elections in Venezuela? Oh, of course. That's part of the sequence of events for the future. This is required to bring about peace. We need free elections. We need transparent and free elections. But when will they be held? I can't tell you that.
Picking up on that question, because I know that there are some, and I'm thinking about the NDP leader who have speculated that we should not be recognizing the government of Guaido because there should be immediate elections. Do you think the circumstances exist right now under Maduro to be able to have any free and fair elections right now? And what do you think would need to be in place before that could actually happen?
That is a very good clarification, because we have that we call, the lawyers we call, a constitutional emergency. So when you have a disposition in the Constitution that said that this transition should be about 30 days in order to call free election, that's not going to happen, because it's an emergency situation that we live in Venezuela. And on the other hand, in order to have a real, free, transparent, and justice election, we just to change the electoral branch. Everybody knows already that the last election in Venezuela has been fraudulent, has been just by the intervention of the government, with a lot of elements, which is very complicated to try to explain in this session. But we need to make some kind of adjustment in the electoral register in Venezuela, because it is manifestly partial to the government in order to looking for free election. But in the meantime, we need to cease the usurpation. So that's the goal right now.
Okay, and I would note that Canada did not recognize that presidential election last May as a legitimate election. So you would say that there would be certain things that have to be in place that would be different from last May in order for there to actually be the capacity right now to have a fair election.
That's right. Canada recognized Mr. Juan Guaido because did not recognize the election that Mr. Maduro just went through last year.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move to a quick question from MP Genis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Canada has recognized President Guaido, and you are his representative here in Canada. the Venezuelan government owns certain diplomatic properties here in Canada. Given that you are the representative of the recognized Venezuelan government, do you have use of those diplomatic properties here in Canada?
Venezuela has in Canada like one embassy, one residence for the ambassador, and 4 consulated. So now they are in possession of the Maduro functionary, and we are just. That's not my priority or our priority to try just to take possession of those facilities. We are looking to try how to explain how to help Canada in order to conduct the humanitarian help, how to help Venezuelan people here in Canada resolving many issues in relation with the status, immigration status, and then we're going to take consideration about such issues.
Yeah, I accept that it's far from the most important thing, but I was curious in terms of the practical dynamics of Canada's recognition of your status.
Okay, in order to, I'm not here to try to as ambassador, I mean, to create some kind of confrontation with them. The idea is inclusion. The idea is not to stop them trying to make its work for the Venezuelan people who live in Canada. So that's our position right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to thank you for your comments and your testimony here this morning. You know this continues to be a priority for the government and for parliamentarians as well. The Canadian people, the Canadian government, we all stand with the people of Venezuela, and we will continue, as you have said here today, working to try and find means to provide relief and positive outcomes, because we see the repression, we see the worsening conditions on the ground, the displacement, the hunger, the malnutrition, the denial of democratic rights, and we know that this cannot be allowed to continue in this vein. So thank you very much for being here today. And with that, we shall adjourn.